Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our April lecture in our Understanding ADHD lecture series. I'm Kathy Essig from the Northern Virginia and DC chapter of CHAD. Tonight, we're pleased to have Alex Chip present ACT and SAT testing for students with ADHD, how to access, how to approach, and when to avoid. Our chapter, CHAD of Northern Virginia and DC, is one of many chapters in the CHAD National Organization, and as such aligns with the national mission of improving the lives of those affected by ADHD. We're a volunteer organization of trained professionals who offer support in a number of ways. In addition to offering this free monthly lecture series on the second Tuesday of each month, we also have support groups for parents, students, and adults, as well as an annual resource fair to highlight ADHD Awareness Month. While we're all volunteers, we cover other expenses through membership dues, donations, and sponsorship. We urge you to become a member if you aren't one already. Now, I'd like to introduce tonight's speaker, Alex Chip. Alex founded Top Score Education, a boutique tutoring, test prep, and academic services company in 2004. A nationally recognized expert in the SAT and ACT, Alex has tutored thousands of students in these exams over the past 18 years. In addition to his work in test prep, Alex has developed innovative project-based learning programs for students of all ages and launched new Top Score education branches serving students in South Florida and North Carolina. A graduate of Duke University with a BA in English and Johns Hopkins with an MA in nonfiction writing, Alex lives in DC with his wife and 2 children. Welcome, Alex, and thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks so much for having me, Kathy. It's really a pleasure. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I really look forward to sharing some information with you about the ACT and the SAT and how to approach these next couple of years if your student is in high school. This presentation is for all families. 80%, 90% of the information is relevant to anybody who's in high school and thinking about these tests and thinking about not taking these tests. All of that will be discussed, and we'll do some deeper dives into some of the accommodations factors of these exams so that we can look at how, which test to take based on what kind of maybe neurodiversity your student might have. Also with the new digital SAT coming in a few years, how that's going to impact our students and decision-making processes. So I'm really excited to be here. I wanted to sort of break this presentation up into 3 pillars, 3 pieces that we need to look at as any parent. And myself, I'm a parent, and so I was talking with Kathy earlier and said, I always look at this process through the lens of a parent myself and saying these are tough decisions to make for my own kids, and so I know how invested all of you are in your kids' success. So hopefully I can provide a little bit of knowledge here and help you to ask some of the right questions. So the 3 parts of this presentation, we're going to first talk about how to assess the ACT and the SAT, which test might be better for your student. That's a big decision, of course, to make, and it actually is a really difficult one. And oftentimes schools try to provide maybe a flyer or a talk, but it does take a little bit of deeper thinking about finding the best test for your student. So we'll talk about that a little bit. We'll talk about the approach to the exam, talking about timeline. What are the ways that you can think about when is the right time for my student to prepare for these exams? How to approach in terms of best practices for strategies for students who might not learn the same way as everybody else, who need to break things down a little bit more. And so we'll talk a bit about that approach. And then finally, when to avoid the test altogether. We are in sort of a new world where so many schools are test optional. And there are more opportunities to apply to more places. And of course, that can make things difficult in that there's so much choice out there that it can be difficult sometimes to know whether your student should be preparing for a test, how much should they prepare for the test, where do they use their scores, where do they not. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And I've ended each of these three parts of the presentation with a Q&A so that we can look at 4 or 5 slides, talk about some of those topics, and then have a conversation. And I'll take sort of all of your questions real time. If you put them in the chat box at the end of each of these 3 sections, I'll get to those questions. And if there are any questions that I know I'm going to be going over in the next part of the presentation, I'll skip over those. And if there's anything that I missed at the end, we'll have a final Q&A at the end, and I'll make sure that I can get to everybody's queries. So I'll go here with how to assess these tests. And as you look, and hopefully we have some 9th grade parents here, 10th grade parents, 11th grade parents, wherever you are along that journey. Hopefully this is a little helpful. So in the assess portion here, we're going to be talking about some testing accommodations, which of course will be relevant to a lot of parents of students with ADHD. We're going to talk about the PSAT, the ACT versus the SAT, and how to assess which one to choose, the digital SAT, and how to assess whether it's going to be a good test for your student. In the approach section, we'll talk about that timeline, different preparation options your student will have, and some best practices for how to approach that test. And then finally, in the avoid section, we'll talk about test optional and about what that might mean for your student and some of the decisions that you'll have to make, and give you, a little bit more knowledge with which to make those decisions. We'll also talk a little bit about the academics and the narrative of the student, because if you do decide to go test optional, then that's one less piece of information and data that schools have to think about your student, and therefore everything else gets amplified and magnified. And of course, that's wonderful in a lot of ways. That's the point of test optional, is that the things that your student is great at should be magnified and amplified. And but it's something to think about and to be intentional about. So we'll talk about that a little bit at the end, and with the final Q&A to make sure that I got to everybody's questions. And I'm excited to see some questions in the chat box over the course of this first section. And as soon as we're done chatting about the digital SAT, we'll make sure to get to those questions. So testing accommodations, of course, accommodations can mean many, many things. In the next slide, I'll go over some of the different accommodations types, but more generally speaking, a few bullet points here that you're going to really want to be prepared for, again, whether your student is 9th, 10th, 11th grade, is to start early and apply for both tests. Now, this is where it gets a little bit sticky, because the application process for the SAT is different from the application process for the ACT when it comes to accommodations. And so it's important to start early, talk to the counselor at your school. If your student does have any accommodations at school, whether that's for extra time, whether that's for only one test in a day at school, whether that's for smaller group testing for tests at school, whatever the accommodations your student might have at the school, you're going to want to talk to the counselor who helps to arrange those and confirm those, and talk to them about that SAT and that ACT earlier than you would think. Even in 9th grade, if you know your student is going to need accommodations 2 years later, just start the conversation at that point. There may not be anything that you need to do at that point. All the paperwork might be in line, but that counselor is going to have experienced the pitfalls of students and parents who sort of left things to the last minute, and will be able to advise you on that. You apply through the school. The PSAT and the SAT, it's virtually all done through the school, so that's actually a little bit easier. The ACT has a bit of a wrinkle in applying for accommodations. For most students, you'll go to the school and you'll say, all right, I want to apply for accommodations for my student who will take the ACT next year, and I want her to have 50% extended time based on her learning plan at the school. And a lot of the counselors, they'll tell you, okay, you need to actually go register for an ACT exam first, and then we can do our part and confirm the accommodations with all the paperwork. And so that's a different path than the SAT. Most students have to follow that path, and so you'll actually have to register for an ACT exam. And this is where it gets a little sticky. Again, if you're a forward-looking freshman or sophomore who just wants to make sure that your paperwork is in line and that you will receive your accommodations, you may not plan to take the test 5 months from now. And so you don't want to register for a test, but unfortunately for most students, that's just their process. So you'll find that the counselors at the school are very helpful, but don't be surprised if you go to them and say, I want to apply for accommodations for the SAT and the ACT, we're a little early, but I want to make sure that everything's in line, that everything that we need is there. Some students have been denied extended time because they didn't show enough use of their accommodations at school over the past year or 2 years, or their accommodations at the school were informal. So there's a lot of pitfalls that you don't realize until you slip and fall in them. And so the best thing you can do is, as early as possible, just start that conversation with your counselor and make sure that all the ducks are in a row. Along those lines, different learning plans mean different timelines and qualifications for accommodations. So for instance, if your student has a 504 plan or an IEP at their school, those are pretty ironclad evidence for the fact that your student will need accommodations for the SAT and the ACT. And in fact, the ACT since this past September has basically rubber stamped any 504 or IEP accommodations that the school has formally on file. You'll be able to get those same accommodations for taking your ACT. Now, the ILP is a little different, and that's often for students who are at independent or maybe parochial schools who might not have an official or more formal 504 or IEP. Your ILP, your individual learning plan, might not be as ironclad evidence. You may need to show a little bit more paperwork, a little bit more history, may need a letter from a teacher showing that this accommodation has really made a difference in my student's work. So those qualifications do differ a little bit based on which plan you have. And if you have an ILP, all the more reason to start the process a little earlier to make sure that your counselor feels that you have gotten all the history, any letters you need, any updated educational testing, which is sort of the next point here, which is that at some point for an ILP, educational testing may be updated, and or may need to be updated. And so that's something to take into consideration, because oftentimes doing the testing can take several months to get on someone's calendar to get that updated testing. Or if you've never done it before and you've received informal accommodations at the school, extra time from kind teachers, that's the kind of thing that it does take a while. So back to sort of all of these, back to the first bullet point, which is starting this process early. If you are doing updated educational testing in high school, either for these tests or just because the last testing was 5 years ago and kids' brains change, and you want to know, where is he or she now? Where's their brain working right now? Where are they struggling? Where have they overcome some earlier challenges as they've matured? So you want to think about also how long that testing will last as you go off to college, because you want to make sure that if you're going to do that testing and put that expense and time into it and those resources, you're going to want to be able to use those accommodations that come out of that, the recommendations from that diagnosis, as long as possible, and take them with you to college. Now, this sort of begins a little bit of a conversation that we're going to get deeper into, which is the SAT or the ACT. And students with testing accommodations of extended time, it's almost always ACT we find is the better exam. Not always necessarily on the first day, but if you take two students and they put the same level of effort towards the two exams and they have extended time on both exams, the ACT in the long run will almost always be the higher ceiling for that student. I'll go into why when we talk about ACT and SAT in a little bit greater detail. But for students with extra time accommodations, that ACT is almost always the default. That's not just the sort of a top score philosophy or methodology. That's uniform again across almost the entire industry, and thousands and thousands of students having come through and tutors seeing the same patterns hold true for a good 80 to 90% of the population. Of course, that leaves 10 to 20% of the population where we're going to have outliers here or there, and I'll talk about where those outliers might be again as we talk about SAT and ACT. As far as those accommodations go, students who have accommodations, who take a diagnostic test but receive extended time for the ACT, I've found that those score increases tend to be the largest of all of our students historically. Students with accommodations tend to underperform in diagnostic tests. It's a long test for them with extended time. They don't have the adrenaline of the real exam to help push them through to the end. It's a practice test. And so as you can imagine, the same as running kind of a practice marathon versus running the real marathon, you're going to have a lot more energy at that real marathon with that adrenaline running and everybody running next to you. So students will often underperform in diagnostic tests across the board, but accommodation students especially, they also often start this process with a lot of self-doubt. And I don't want to blanket, make any kind of blanket statements, but I just have seen a lot of students who come into the diagnostic sort of portion of a program that I run, and they often have sort of an expression or feelings of I can't. And that often shows up in the diagnostic tests, and oftentimes they'll shut down instead of really try hard because they don't want to feel that the result is really indicative of their effort. So I often see accommodation students have really low diagnostic tests, but as I say here, they're often my most determined warriors once they get into a program. And that's part of the reason they see some of the largest score increases. So I often will tell students who may get a bad diagnostic test or a poor PSAT sophomore year, especially those with accommodations, say, you just need the tools, you need the confidence, and don't doubt yourself just based on an early test like this. A few accommodations types, accommodations that are available for students to apply for. The most common is a standard 50% extended time. Most students, that's what they need. That's really the number one thing, is they just need that extra time to be able to breathe, to read questions twice, to read through passages a little more slowly, to utilize a few of the reading tools that they've learned through schools or specialists or tutors, to be able to understand that they may need to read the topic sentences of each paragraph twice to understand what those main ideas are. And so that 50% extended time just gives them that time that they need to do so. 100% extended time is offered to students. It's not often offered for the SAT. The ACT is more likely to provide 100% extended time than the SAT is. Likewise, multiple day testing is much more often granted by the ACT than the SAT. And so students with 100% extended time and multiple day testing, that sort of helps. That's the best of both worlds for a lot of students, because when they have to do the entire extended time test in one day, the break that they're getting from having a little more time might be offset by taking a very long test and facing fatigue by the end of that exam. So the multiple day testing will give them extended time, but also break up the test into 2 to 4 days. And that will then give them both the extended time they need while keeping the test, at 2 hours or less per day, versus taking a 5-hour single day, 50% extended time exam. So those are obviously attractive accommodations if a student's diagnosis and history warrant them. Stop the clock breaks are a little bit more rare. Those are for students, might be a student with Crohn's, might be a student who has diabetes and needs to take insulin breaks. There are other reasons for stop the clock breaks, but either your doctor or a therapist or a counselor at the school will often be able to tell you if your student sort of might qualify for that. If you feel like you have a student who really needs, in sort of a long period of time, just has to be able to stop and have a brain breather, there may be something in the diagnosis that would warrant that. So those are a few of the different timing accommodations that are offered. The most common, like I said, is that 50% extended time. For the other ones, you're going to have pretty specific diagnoses to be granted those. As far as format, a decent number of students who I see are granted a no bubble answer sheet. They don't have to bubble. They're able to circle right on their test booklet. And that obviously, takes that whole, piece of the puzzle out of it, of staring at this empty page. And you'd be surprised how often students sort of across the spectrum will miss bubble. And as you can imagine, neurodiverse students and students who have ADHD in particular, who tend to, those little tasks, they tend to often take for granted. You'll see sometimes the bubbling is a piece that really, it really gives them trouble. Not 15 questions, but consistently 2, 3, 4 missed bubbles every test. And so that no bubble answer sheet can be really helpful in eliminating that facet. There's a large type format. That's pretty rare, and that's usually a little bit more for students who might have some dyslexia might have a little bit more trouble with obviously some eyesight issues, eyesight differences. And so they do have tests that have larger type. Audio tape or reader support, that's getting into a bit more of a rare accommodation, but it is there, it does exist. And for students who might have that kind of accommodation at school or something similar, they do offer those for the SAT and the ACT. I see it a little bit more again for the ACT. The ACT tends to be more friendly when it comes to these specific accommodations, whereas the SAT and ACT are pretty similar in terms of granting the basic 50% extended time. SAT might be a little bit friendlier in that, but ACT, since again, like I said, in September, since they started basically rubber stamping anybody with a 504 or IEP at the school, it's gotten a little bit easier with the ACT. As far as the test setting, they have preferential seating. I've actually seen more students with small group settings, just where it'll be 3 or 4 students in a classroom instead of 10 to 12. Preferential seating, though, is an accommodation that exists. If you have a student who at school does better when they sit in, let's say, the front row, where they're not staring at 12 students in front of them working furiously and seemingly way ahead of your student, and that can certainly build some anxiety. Preferential seating can help them just find a seat that helps them to work better. Whereas for most students, they could care less. And so if you have a student who really has a place they like to be, it might be worth pursuing because it's a worthwhile accommodation. Getting into the tests now themselves, the PSAT. What to know here about the PSAT? It's slightly shorter than the SAT. The scoring, instead of being out of 1600, is out of 1520. It's given at most schools in mid-October. Some schools give it in late October. For sophomores, some freshmen even do it. There's a freshman 8-9 PSAT. I don't really put a lot of stock into that. The PSAT 10 for sophomores is the one to really think about. It's to start sort of planning for. And by planning, I just mean educating your student about what it's for, which is really for practice, but it's also for data to make important decisions that will be coming in the next year. So I tell all of my sophomores, that it's only practice. You shouldn't have any pressure on you, but just do your very best. You don't need to prepare for the sophomore PSAT. You just need to understand what you're going to be tested on, which is just math, algebra 1, geometry, basic passages with questions after them, and some basic punctuation rules, commas and semicolons. And you're just there to do your best. And I think sometimes schools emphasize so much the fact that this sophomore PSAT doesn't count for anything, with the good intention of helping students to not stress. And I don't want them to stress, but they de-emphasize it so much, or emphasize the meaninglessness of it, that students really go in and they waste that opportunity to understand a little better where their strengths and weaknesses lie in testing. And so I really urge sophomore students and parents going into that October test, you don't need to prepare for it, but you should really go in and do your best. Make sure you have your calculator that day. Don't forget your calculator. Don't stay up till 2 a.m. beforehand because I'll have that 3-hour time to snooze before I have real classes in the afternoon. It's really important data for people like me to see, for parents who are knowledgeable about what some of these scores mean to see, and for a counselor at the school might be able to look at them and advise you on what to do junior year, where now the PSAT might be something that's important for your student. Now for juniors, the PSAT, this is where a National Merit Scholarship comes into play, or at least being in the running for it, or a commendation. And so what that is that if you reach a certain benchmark in your score, and it's a very, very high benchmark, it's different in every state. And because we're in an area with really great schools with elite students in DC, Maryland, Virginia, those benchmarks are very high. So you really have to crush that junior year PSAT to be in any kind of a consideration for a National Merit Scholarship. So a lot of parents will ask me, is it worth preparing for the junior PSAT? And every student has a different context, but I usually say as a 10th grader, if you went into the PSAT without real preparation and you got a 1350 or higher, it may really be worth your while to put the effort in to try to go for that National Merit Scholarship. Whereas if your student was at an 1150 as a sophomore, it doesn't mean that there's no chance that they can achieve that National Merit Scholarship as a junior. It just means that the probability is quite low, and their time is going to be better spent preparing for the SAT, ACT proper, getting great grades in their school, pursuing their passions, over the summer. Those things are going to be a much more high yield effort than preparing and trying to nail that national merit number as a junior. So 1350 is generally my golden number. But of course, if a student's 1330 and they're motivated, I'm not going to tell them not to go for it. And if you have a 1370, there's no guarantee that you'll get there. So those are just that's just a number to sort of throw out there to think about if you have a student who's considering trying to approach that junior year National Merit Scholarship number. If you are going to do that and you are going to prepare for the PSAT, then I usually, support the student also taking the SAT in the months directly after or even a little before, and prepare for the two tests at the same time because they're nearly identical exams. The SAT is a little longer and maybe a little harder, but they're so similar that you can really kill two birds with one stone. So we do have a lot of students who will prepare in the summer after sophomore year and early fall, and take the early October SAT, the October PSAT, and then the December SAT, and try to knock it out with those tests, with the October and December SATs, and do their best to see if they can hit that national merit number that they need in the October PSAT. So that's for students who are really going for it. That's not an uncommon program to see. Again, we're going to get to timeline a little later in the presentation. So if that feels early, please do not start hyperventilating. Nobody has to start that early, and that is early in the game. Just for students who are really going after that National Merit Scholarship number and putting the time into that PSAT, you want to try to, get double the reward for the time spent. As far as that number, National Merit Consideration, there's 139 questions on a PSAT. The number changes every year, but you kind of have to plan to miss fewer than 6 of those 139 total questions to really be in the running at all, to sort of hit that cutoff. It's a little different Maryland versus Virginia and year to year, but that just shows you sort of the level of accuracy you need to have across the test to get into that running. ACT versus SAT, some basics here. So they're both 3.5-hour tests. Again, for now, we'll talk about the digital SAT coming up. They're taken primarily during junior year or senior fall for college admission. The new digital SAT will debut in March of 2024. The digital PSAT will debut in October of 2023. Now that's in the US. The digital SAT will actually be out internationally earlier than that. It'll be in 2023. But for us, for the US here, it's going to be the PSAT in October of 23, and the SAT will debut in March of 24. And at that point, we'll see the changes that we're going to talk about in just a moment. Now, as far as all colleges accepting the ACT and the SAT exams, yes, they all do. There's no bias one or the other. It really, Northeast schools don't hate the ACT, Midwest schools don't hate the SAT. Doesn't work like that. Everybody accepts both tests. What you want to do is figure out which test is a better format for your student's skill set and address that test and approach that test. As far as how many times a student should take the test, once you've picked the better test for your skill set, generally you want to try it 2 to 3 times over about a 4 to 6 month period. I say 2 to 3 times. If you take it one time and you nail it, of course, wonderful, and you're done. But for most students, because going in for that first time, if they put preparation into it, that's a lot of pressure. And in the SAT, you've got 3 different subjects. In the ACT, you've got 4 different subjects. So as you can imagine, if you're going into your first test with all the pressure on you and you've got 4 different tasks in front of you, the probability that you're going to do your absolute best in all 4 of those categories under all of that pressure, it's a little low. That's a lot to sort of handle all on one day. So most students are going to learn from that first experience, continue working at it, figure out from the data what their weaknesses are, and they're going to do better in their second test attempt. And then super scoring often would then sort of incentivize a third attempt, where maybe you're focusing on 1 or 2 subjects where you feel like I can just get a few more questions right in those couple subjects, and you focus your energy there. Super scoring is the process by which most schools for the SAT and at least half of schools for the ACT we'll take your best scores from across different tests and put them together for a super score. So for instance, if on the SAT verbal in March, you get a 700 in verbal, 600 in math, and then you go to take the test again in May and you focus entirely on that math. You're happy with your verbal score. You put all of your effort into math. That math goes up to 700, but the verbal this time goes down to 600 because you were so hyper-focused on math, you forgot some of your grammar rules. Well, for most schools, you're going to be able to you'll submit both of those tests, and they'll take the 700 verbal from March and the 700 math from May and put them together for a 1400 super score. And that will be your overall best score. Most schools do that for the SAT. University of Michigan does not, and the University of Texas school system does not. There's a few other schools that don't super score the SAT. The ACT, there's more schools that don't super score. So I always urge my students, and that can even be part of your decision-making process. If you're really close about whether you want to take the SAT or the ACT, you might look at the 3 schools you're most interested in and see if they super score or not. And if none of them super score the ACT and they all super score the SAT, that might be the last little push in one direction. So that's something to be aware of. Most students think about it a little bit more after they take their first exam and they say, okay, these are my scores. Now, the schools I'm interested in, how many of them super score? And then you can tailor the work thereafter towards those weaknesses if a lot of your schools do super score, because you're going to get to keep those great scores that you had in the first test attempt, let's say in 2 of your 4 ACT subjects, and focus on the other 2 into your second test, and obviously have a greater probability of being great in those 2 since you put more effort towards them. Super scoring is obviously it can be a complex issue, so I'm also happy to take questions on that during the Q&A. As far as registering for the tests, you go right to the website collegeboard.org and actstudent.org. If you have a lot of accommodations, if you're applying for many accommodations, especially if you're applying for more than the standard 50% extended time, a little bit more of that will happen through the school. So if you plan on applying for accommodations, you'll definitely talk to the school before doing the actual registration and figure out next steps with them. As far as which test to take here, there are several major factors in the ACT-SAT decision. And of course, let's all agree from the beginning that the end goal is where is the higher ceiling. So a lot of times we can sort of be a little bit myopic in our thinking and look at, let's say, some data or diagnostic testing early on, or a few, an SSAT from 2 years ago. And we might get sort of bogged down in that and not think about where does this student have the most room for growth. And so that needs to be a part of the consideration, is where is the student now and where could they be with hard work and effort and preparation. And so these are some of the factors that are going to go into figuring out where that higher ceiling might lie. So the first step is diagnostic testing. Ideally, we can take a full test in both, but frankly, it's hard for a lot of students to be able to come in on 2 different Sundays or Saturdays and take full 3.5-hour diagnostic exams during the busy school year. So a lot of companies like mine offer a hybrid exam that's half SAT, half ACT, because the results are extrapolated a little bit, because the test, it's 2 tests. It's basically 6.5 hours of testing condensed into 3.5 hours. So the extrapolation of the data can maybe can take some missed questions and overemphasize the weakness, or take some questions that were a passage that was done well and overemphasize the strength. Anytime, the less data you have, the more extrapolation you're doing. But the benefit of doing a hybrid exam, one is being able to do it all in one day, and also your student really gets to compare the SAT and the ACT apples to apples on the same day, same energy level, same focus, same whatever anxieties there are that day are the same for both tests, and they can come out. And as important as the score is going to be the student coming out and saying, wow, this test I feel better about. Sometimes students will get a higher score in one, but they are convinced, and they convince all the rest of us, I'm going to do better in that other test. I know it in my gut. And I am in the business of trusting students when they say I am motivated to take this test rather than this one. So that's something that a hybrid exam does for us versus taking a test a month or 2 apart. you might, as you know, you might get Jekyll one day, Hyde the other. So it's a little bit harder necessarily to compare the mindset of the student on those 2 days. Another way to do it is, if your student, like I said, they tried hard because you listened and you told your student, give that 10th grade PSAT, your best effort. That's a pretty good realistic SAT score. That's what the PSAT is meant to do. It's meant to give you a realistic SAT score. So that PSAT score can function as an SAT diagnostic. And then if you take a full length ACT, you can compare those numbers. Now, I always love for my student to come in and take an SAT later to sort of confirm that. But again, if you have a student who's just not going to want to take a full ACT one day and a full SAT on a whole nother day, you can use that PSAT in place of the SAT for comparison's sake. As far as processing speed, this is really the big decision, really the biggest factor. If the diagnostic testing tells you, on one test your kid's here, on one test they're here, that's probably the number one factor. But in processing speed, that's going to be a big one. The ACT is just a much faster exam. And so will the student be able to finish in time without having their accuracy compromised? And so when you have a student in standard time do the hybrid, a lot of them will come out and they'll say, I'm done with the ACT. It was too fast. I can't do it. And I trust them. And that's why, coming back to the accommodations, when students have that 50% extended time, a lot of students are going to be able to finish that ACT with that 50% extra time. And if you take that speed issue out of it, off the table, that's a huge part of the ACT's challenge that you've removed. Now, if you have a student who receives accommodations and they take their ACT practice test and they still run out of time, which happens to some students, that's where your outlier comes in. That student may be more comfortable on the SAT. But if you have a student who can take the ACT in extended time, if they have those accommodations and they can finish in time, they have time to check over their work, the ceiling is almost always going to be higher in that ACT, because the ACT is a more straightforward and objective test. The SAT is a more complex and subjective test. And so the ACT will always open itself up more to patterns and strategy and mantras of following these same steps over and over, because the test is more straightforward. The evidence is more black and white. Whereas on the SAT, where the reading tends to be more subjective and more profound reading questions, a student could have all the time in the world. They could have unlimited time. But if they can't understand that the Jane Austen heroine really doesn't want to marry this guy, even though she's saying, sure, I'll marry you, but she really hates him. If they don't get that, extra time is not going to help them with that. Whereas on the ACT, a passage is more likely to ask, where was the heroine's suitor born? And you just have to find where that guy was born in, Wiltshire. And then you are, that's the challenge of the ACTs. You have to be able to do that in time. So if you have extended time, you're now cutting out a big challenge, whereas the SAT's challenge remains. As far as math goes, we're sort of going down the list in terms of factors. Our diagnostic testing is number 1, processing speed number 2, math is number 3 here. There is more advanced content on the ACT math, but it's only a quarter of your score, whereas SAT math is less advanced, but it makes up 50% of your score. So I have students who will come in and they'll say, I don't like the math, I don't like standardized testing math, I'm not good at math. So I hear the ACT math is hard, so I want to do the SAT. And yes, the SAT math might be a little easier for you, but it's also 50% of your score. Whereas in the ACT, if math is a weakness for you, it's only a quarter of your score. And maybe that score may be better, a weakness is better hidden in the ACT. So it's not as easy a decision when looking at the two tests as to say, oh, my student's great at math, so they should take test X, because there's nuance to that. As far as what math these tests do test, the ACT tests through pre-calculus, the SAT tests through algebra 2. So it does impact the timing a little bit. I'll get to that when we talk about timelines in the sort of second portion of this presentation. But math, that's why math, while it seems like it would be an important factor in the decision-making process, sometimes it can get washed out a little bit by the fact that while the ACT is more advanced in math, it's also a smaller percentage of your score. Finally, personality considerations. Don't put baby in a corner, but do consider your student's temperament. Now, I had a picture of Patrick Swayze in the bottom right of this slide originally, but my wife walked by and saw it, and she said, your video of your face is going to be up way too close to a picture of young Patrick Swayze, and so you're going to have to remove that. So that's why he's not there anymore, but the quote remained. So we don't want to necessarily try to typecast our kids. However, there are certain personalities that tend to gravitate towards one test or another. And so when we're looking for early decision-making sort of factors, or we've kind of got a tie on some diagnostic testing work, we might look at some of the personality considerations of our students in trying to figure out, again, where that higher ceiling is, when maybe today they're pretty close in terms of their score. Where will they be after they put the work in? The ACT worker bee versus the SAT smart slacker. The ACT worker bee, the reason why that's over in that category is that the ACT, like I said, the math is more advanced. The test follows more strictly these patterns. So if a student is willing to work harder to learn the advanced math, work harder to learn those patterns, their score will go up. It is sort of a very simple causality there. The SAT, because the test is a little bit more subjective and a little bit more intuitive, and sometimes it's a little bit more whether you get the paragraph or you get the metaphor, a student who's clever but not necessarily going to put the time into memorizing a bunch of formulas, they're not going to be at a disadvantage against that worker bee if they do the SAT, because that worker bee, again, they may study all the Jane Austen in the world, but they show up and then that test, it wasn't the Jane Austen passage, it was the Dickens passage. So doing all that work, that might not help you as much. So the ACT worker bee and SAT smart slacker is something we've seen for quite some time. As far as organization, the ACT, again, anything that follows, the more that a test follows patterns, the more you want to follow patterns. So the student who's able to remain organized in the way they approach the test, they're going to really benefit from that on the ACT. My SAT students, the need for the organization there is a little bit less strong. And so students who are a little bit more poorly organized, or they don't think necessarily sort of, or they have difficulty on their own doing that. If they're able to be trained, then they may be a great ACT kid. But if they're going to pursue this test, especially on their own, and they're not going to get organized enough to list questions by category and question type, that SAT, again, a more subjective intuitive test, might be better. As far as a STEM kid versus reads for pleasure, the STEM kid, there is a science section of the ACT. It's not science from school. It's much more just a scientific reading of graphs and charts and understanding basic experimental design, things we learned really in 7th, 8th grade of science. But the ACT math, like I said, it is a little bit more advanced. And so if you have a student who's on an advanced math track and who loves science, they may just have an edge on those harder ACT math questions. And the science, they may just enjoy it more because they're into science. And if you enjoy something more, you're probably going to work harder at it. As far as the reads for pleasure on the SAT readings are simply harder. As I said before, they're more complex, they're more profound. So if you have a student who reads a lot and who understands nuance and tone and loves fiction, they're going to have an edge on the SAT. They aren't going to do poorly on the ACT reading by any means, but they lose that advantage over other students. An ACT student can get a great ACT score even if they hate reading, because they're really good at finding facts quickly, which is what the ACT focuses on more, whereas the SAT focuses more on interpretation. Time. So time is on my side. Yes, it is. So the time that refers to the accommodations. If you do have extended time, the ACT is almost always the better test for you, as I mentioned before. On the SAT, another great song in the summertime. A lot of students will want to prepare in the summer after sophomore year and test in the fall of junior year. And for the math reason I mentioned before, that can be a little sticky for the ACT because they may just be starting pre-calculus in the fall. So that's a tough time to take a math test where there is pre-calculus. It's not a game, it's not a deal breaker, I should say. But if you're pretty even in your decision-making process, you feel like you could do okay on both tests, but you do want to take it early, the SAT from a math standpoint is simply going to be easier to do early in that summer after sophomore year and fall of junior year, if it's a priority for you to try to get this done early. Finally, the ACT quizzes every day, please, and SAT, I'll rock the final exam. The ACT, because there is more content to learn, because there's more patterns to learn, it takes a gradual accumulation. You can't cram for it and learn it all in a couple of weeks. The SAT is a little bit of a better test for crammers because, again, going back to that smart slacker piece, there is a little bit less in the way of patterns. There's less advanced math you have to learn. There's a little bit more that depends on you being sharp on test day than the ACT. The ACT depends a little bit more on the work that you've put in and day out for months leading up to the test. And so for the student who's ready to put that work in, that ACT you're gonna have an advantage there. And the SAT can cover up that weakness a little bit if you know your student's really gonna, they're only ready and willing to prepare for 3 weeks leading up to the test. That might be an SAT kid. Digital SAT. Okay, it's coming here. It'll be here before we know it. In March 2024 for the SAT and earlier for the PSAT. So a lot of parents have been asking me, what's happening with this digital SAT? What's it all about? So first thing parents say is how, what, why? How can this be true? I agree. To me, it's an absolute dagger. I'm a pencil and paper guy. So for me, there's a lot of reasons why I don't like it, but in any event, it's here, it's coming, and it'll be taken on the computer, and it'll be 2 instead of 3 hours. I'll talk a little bit in a minute about why the SAT feels they can get the same information out of 2 hours. The math will be less wordy, and there will be no non-calculator questions. That's a big change for students. The math will be less wordy. The word problems will be more straightforward, which is great. Students, when they're taking their math test, it's very sad to see them know the math but get tripped up by the language of a long wordy paragraph. And then they'll be able to use their calculators across the board. Whatever you think of that, they're going to have that opportunity and have that option. Verbal passages will be 1 paragraph long instead of 5 to 6, 7 paragraphs long, and there will be 1 question per passage. That's a huge change. They're going to give more time per individual question, and they're going to test a broader range of topics. That was a really big change, and one that was a bit controversial because, again, it's a few purists like me wonder, why a student can't read 4 or 5 paragraphs and answer, 8 questions. Same reason I asked why, so few of our English classes at sophomore and junior year actually make students read novels anymore. But that's sort of the direction that we're heading, and that's whether I like it or not, that's the way schools are moving, and that's the way this test is moving. And so for students who hate those longer passages, this is a big win for them. They're going to be able to read 1 paragraph, answer 1 question, and move on to a new topic. And I'm going to talk about this change in digital SAT. And for our ADHD students in particular, this might be a really good change, especially for those who are not going to do a lot of preparation and have to sort of get by more on their own sort of natural intuition. That'll be a big change that works in their favor. So in that regard, it's great. Section adaptive. This is a big change as well. This means that students will receive different tests based on in-test performance. So all students will, let's say, get the same first 10 math questions, but based on how they perform in those first 10 math questions, they'll get a different set of next 10 math questions. And they already do this for many graduate school tests. And adaptive testing, what it allows test makers to do, it's to give more permutations to an exam. As you can imagine, if you think about the juniors in this country who are, let's say, have the most trouble with math, who are barely working through addition, subtraction, multiplication, they may not remember their times tables. And then you have students, at TJ who are MIT bound. Should those 2 people really be taking the exact same 58 questions? What adaptive testing does is it sort of breaks down the groups a little more, and it will group weaker math students together so that students can show, okay, I might not be a TJ MIT kid, but, with reasonable math questions that aren't so hard, I can show you what I can do. And likewise, some of those really advanced math students that's their passion and they've worked really, really hard at it. I have students who will do 58 SAT questions and 56 of them will be really, really easy for them. So what are we really testing them on? It's just avoiding careless errors. That's not what we should be testing. In this new adaptive way, they'll get the same first half as everybody else, but based on their performance there, they'll get a second half of questions that are much more challenging. They can really show what they're able to accomplish. And so in that way, section adaptive is good because it's going to allow students to show the test makers, colleges, whoever is going to be looking at this data are going to be able to show a little bit more realistically, this is who I am as a math student. Reading, writing skills, math content actually tested, 1600 scale. These are the things that are going to stay the same. So the actual skills that are tested, the grammar rules that are tested, the types of reading questions that they ask, what's the primary purpose of this paragraph? What did the author mean by this phrase in the third line? Those types of questions about asking what the student to interpret what was the purpose of the author or the intentions of the author, those will stay the same. Math content, circles, triangles, area, rate, all of those things will continue to be tested. There will still be a 1600 scale, that won't change.
You showered.
You showered already, yeah.
But who got your jammies?
And sorry, I think we've got somebody on sharing. So then the testing at schools or test centers, that will stay the same. You're not going to be testing at home. You're not going to be taking the SAT on your computer at home. That will be either at schools, like it's always been, or prometric test centers, which will be very much like taking it at a school. So that won't change very much. Finally, very relevant to this conversation is accommodations, because in one of the things the SAT has said is that as they move to digital, they will not be providing paper and pencil tests. There will not be an accommodation that you can say, I don't learn well from a digital screen, I need a paper test. They said we're moving to a digital test for everybody. And yet they said students who need accommodations will be supported, but haven't at this point yet provided any information about what that support actually means or will be. So that's a piece that I wish I could answer for you, but it's still a question mark for me and that I'm going to be watching closely as to for students who have who have a reason and have learning reasons to not be able to do this kind of work from a screen. What is that support going to look like? So I don't know yet for that, and that's going to be something for us all to keep an eye on. Why are they making these changes? The adaptive testing, as I mentioned before, it can allow for more precise scoring. It's easier to take and administer and score. The scores will be back to students within days instead of 2 weeks. Better fit for today's students. This is what the College Board says, students, and they of course polled students on this. And as you might imagine, something like 2/3 or 70% of students said they would prefer to take it on a computer screen since they do so much on the screen now anyways. My students, now when you poll students who actually want to prepare and consider themselves hard workers who want to achieve their absolute best on the tests, most of those students actually prefer paper and pencil. But nation at large, students want it digital, and the SAT is giving it to them. As I mentioned, the when, March 2024, and this is for the class of 25. So if you have current ninth graders, that's you. If you have current 10th graders, don't worry, this whole page doesn't mean anything for you. But if you have current ninth graders or lower, their SAT exam starting in March will be the digital SAT exam. Practice materials will be available starting fall 2022. You can even do some sample questions now on the College Board website. If you go there and you or if you Google College Board SAT Digital Suite, they'll have a lot of FAQs answered there and some practice questions. And much more information and practice tests will come out this fall. As far as the ACT, they have not announced what they will do. It's already digital abroad. It's been digital abroad for a few years. They will follow suit eventually. They've talked for years about doing that. I think that they will wait for a year or two to see some of the problems the SAT has and try to fix those problems in advance. But they will be digital. It's only a matter of time. I can't put a date on it. I would guess 26, but we'll see. As far as advice for the ninth graders, these guinea pigs, okay? And so if I were a parent, I would certainly be a little bit uncomfortable about about being in that year where a new test is being introduced. If on the fence and you're going to put the time in to prepare, I would generally take the ACT. If the scores, if diagnostic testing is reasonably close, go with the known entity. Go with the test that there are proven methods of preparing for. The content that's going to be tested. You can study that. Take the test that is known if you're going to prepare for it. However, if you're a slower reader and you don't qualify for accommodations, that ACT is always going to be a really tough test for you. And so you may rather take that new test. If you don't have time to prepare, and I mentioned before, the ACT is better a test taken when you can really put the effort into the preparation for it. If you don't have that time, that SAT, since everybody will kind of be at the same place, a little bit underprepared, since there won't be any existing patterns to that exam, that might be a good test. If you need a shorter test, again, that's a very simple question. If you have 2 hours test versus 3 hour test of SAT versus ACT, maybe that's enough. If you're a student, that's going to be the test for you. And for all those reasons, you might, as a ninth grader now, in 2 years, consider that new digital SAT. As far as the impact on neurodiverse students, and then for our ADHD students, some of the negatives, of course, I think it, of course, promotes intuition over analysis. When you're looking at the screen, there's going to be highlighting tools, but the digital tools from our work with students who were taking the ACT internationally in digital format were certainly harder and more cumbersome to use than the pencil and paper. So students annotate less, they highlight less, they circle less, they put less of their, what I call sort of blood on the page, which to me is their analysis. When they're doing things on the screen, I find their accuracy tends to be lower because it's harder for them to dig into the test. They see everything sort of surface level, and it's a little bit harder for them to dig within a sentence to find out what's the most important tone word in this sentence when they're staring at a screen full of words and they can't underline or circle it. So it promotes intuition over analysis, which to me is a negative. And if it's something that we're trying to teach students, one of the main things that I work with students to do in preparation for either of these exams is to build those powers of analysis and to make evidence-based decisions. And it's just a little harder to do that in a digital format. It encourages showing less work for those reasons before, that it's, again, more cumbersome to do that work on the screen. So they're going to do less of it. And as we know, as our math teachers have been telling our kids for years, show more work. And as our English teachers have been telling our kids, annotate in the margins, and all those things, we lose that in the digital SAT, unfortunately. Finally, transferring the math information can be great peril for neurodiverse students. For ADHD students who are always just 1 foot ahead of themselves, moving a little too fast, that simple process, and I mentioned before, sometimes what catches them the most are these things that are simple, and so therefore they take them for granted. And so just rewriting a long math question from the screen onto their scratch paper so that they can do the work, I can imagine all the errors that we're going to have to address with students just in that transcription. So that's going to be something to watch as well. Positives, they're shorter passages and it's a shorter test, and that could be great for ADHD students who simply just don't want to sit for a 3.5-hour test, let alone if they receive accommodations, a 5-hour test. And so to be able to do 1 paragraph at a time may be a godsend for some of those students. And for them, I'm very happy, and that will be the greatest positive probably to come out of this, is that for students who simply, they're not built to read 6-paragraph Thoreau passages, this is going to be a much better test for them. And so that's a positive. As far as less wordy math questions, I don't want to underestimate the impact of that, because I have some students who are really strong in math, but they might miss only 5 questions on an SAT, but 4 of them may be careless errors made because of the wordiness of the math questions. We can solve that issue, but it's an obstacle that if it's removed by the digital SAT in advance, it's one less obstacle for students, especially ADHD students, to face. As far as some strategies, understanding and practicing with the digital tools, of course, that would seem to go without saying, but I've had a lot of international students for the ACT who didn't get used to, didn't put the time into practicing with that highlighter, to practicing flagging questions, to going through the motions of the process of that digital test taking. And when you get to the exam, you don't want any distractions. And a digital tool that you don't know how to use well is a distraction. Taking intentional steps to avoid transcription errors, those math errors I talked about above, it'll have to be a strategy, is that your student, if working on their own or with a parent or with a tutor, they're going to have to take that into consideration, as whenever they sit down for a math test that's digital, they have to put 5% of their entire energy towards simply rewriting the questions correctly and not rushing that step. It's totally doable. It's just going to take discipline and focus on that particular step. With adaptive testing, careless errors can hurt you more. If you make a couple errors in that first portion of the test, you may get that second portion that isn't really up to the standard that you would be able to accomplish. And this is, I don't want to go too deep into adaptive testing. The SAT, it's called modular adaptive testing, and so you get a big chunk of questions, and based on that big chunk, you get a new big chunk. And so if you make a couple of careless errors on that first big chunk, your next big chunk is going to be decided by that. And the artificial intelligence of the computer system is going to think, you're this level math student, where you may very well be this level math student, but you just made a couple careless errors. In question adaptive, which is a different form of adaptive, it adapts every single question. And so if you make one careless error, you might go down a level, but if you get 3 questions in a row, you shoot right back up. And so it's a little bit easier to recover. So in any event, careless errors can hurt students more on adaptive testing. And so our students are going to have to be that much more careful. Of course, they have to be careful all the time to avoid those errors. But in particular here with adaptive testing, it might put them into a whole different subgroup that they don't want to be in. So that was the longest section. There was a lot there with the PSAT, the SAT, ACT accommodations, digital SAT. So that was sort of the longest piece of the presentation, but I did want to get to a Q&A here. I did have 4 questions that I wanted to answer before we move on to the next portion of the presentation. So the first question that I got here was about a child in 11th grade with ADHD and attentive type, LD in math, wants to attend art school, has a not great GPA, and does not want to take the ACT or SAT, and then ask for recommendations. And so, obviously that's a very specific question, but there are elements of that are sort of relevant to the larger group, and really comes down to that, that ACT or SAT part, that test optional part. And I think for that student specifically, wanting to attend art school, when you want to attend a school that's a little bit more specific to a skill that you have, the ACT or SAT in my mind are going to matter a little bit less, because if you're great in that skill that the school is all about, then some of these other things tend to matter a little bit less. Whereas if you're applying as a broader student to a broader array of subjects, then they're going to want to know that you're able to handle everything across the board, and you're going to have to show a little bit more well-roundedness. I will get to the ACT, SAT, and test optional sort of a part of the discussion later on. It'll be in the last sort of our 3 sections here. And I see that we have another question here about taking the diagnostic test with a separate section each day instead of all at once. And so there are absolute pros and cons to this. And so as opposed to coming in on, let's say, a Sunday to a company like mine, or sometimes a lot of schools will set up a practice test at the school, which is great. And so your student can go in and take the practice test on that day and get their diagnostic scores. And so I think that if your student can handle that, if you believe in your student to be able to go into a full diagnostic test in a single day and put forth reasonable amount of effort, don't expect them to go in and leave claw marks on the desk, because they were so into it. It's a diagnostic test that we have to have reasonable expectations of that effort. But if you are concerned about them mailing it in because it's just too long for them to focus, absolutely trying to take a diagnostic test, maybe one section on different days, might give us better results. Now you're going to have to proctor that as a parent, because few companies are going to be set up to really give just one section on a bunch of different days, that's going to be a little bit more difficult to find. But if you're going to proctor as a parent, and if you know you're going to get better data that way, ultimately that's what we want to know. We want to know, where is the student struggling? What do they know? What do they not know? How do they do on the time? From that, if you're doing that testing at home versus in a classroom, we are missing the element of anxiety and that comes from being in a formal proctored setting. But ultimately, you've got to make that decision as a parent. It's definitely contextual. And so I would never argue against a parent who said, my kid's not going to come in for a 4-hour diagnostic test and show anything resembling what they can do. So I'm going to give them one section each weekend for 4 weekends and make them do their absolute best so we get a sense of where they really are. I'll absolutely take that over a bad diagnostic that was done all in one day. As far as adaptive testing, giving more credit for harder questions, the way that they haven't announced exactly how the adaptive testing will be scored, but generally with that adaptive testing, what would happen is that if you move on from when that sort of tree splits, if you missed several questions on that easier version, you're going to get an easier next module. And even if you're perfect in that module, there's only so high on the score range you're going to be able to go. Whereas that when you go to that harder set of questions, now you've got opportunity to achieve higher scores there. Now, it's very possible that you go into those two paths. If you get every single question right on that easy module and you only get half the questions right on the harder module, you may end up with the same score. There's going to be overlap, but the ceiling will be capped if you're a student and you miss too many questions in the first half. Though, of course, would be the same thing without adaptive testing. If you miss a bunch of easy questions, you can only score so high. So it won't be that it gives more credit for harder questions. It will just be that it gives you access to a higher score. As far as whether the tests are fair and if a student had a bad day, if he or she is misjudged off of those tests, I certainly think that that's sort of a conversation it's a longer conversation. That's like lunch conversation or maybe a bottle of wine conversation as far as whether the tests are fair or not. I'm going to leave that to the end for anybody who sort of wants to, to stick around. I want to get sort of the more of the hardcore information here, the black and white. That obviously goes into some gray area. So I'd like to put a pin in that question, but whoever wrote it, if you stick around at the end, I'd love to share sort of my thoughts on the fairness of the test. You're going to hate it because it depends, and as a lot of things that are subjective are. So, but we'll get to that at the end. Returning to the second part of our program here, the timeline for standardized testing. And again, this is going to be pretty similar if you have a student who has no accommodations or has accommodations, has ADHD or doesn't. The timeline is really based around your student's availability to prepare for the exam and a little bit on a few M's, which we're going to talk about here, which are math and maturity. So to start, we'll talk about the traditional way that we used to take the SAT or the ACT, is that we would take it in the spring of junior year one time, and then we would take it in the fall of senior year. That was sort of, I remember, in the late 90s, that's sort of the way that we did it. That was sort of the standard. Why did they do it then? The two reasons: math and maturity. By that point, you would have learned all the math you need to know for the tests, and you'd be mature enough to say, okay, yeah, college is coming and it matters. I'm ready to put the effort into this. When can students test? It's really year round. The ACT or SAT is offered almost every month except for January. So you truly can have it your way. I like the Burger King guy because he also looks just like Tevye from Fiddler in the Roof in the meme above. So I've got both of them together. So we have the old and the new. You can do it the traditional way. That's just fine. Or you can have it your way. If you want to do it another time, you can. The tests are offered so often that you really have a lot of options. That can create stress. Having a lot of options does create stress, but it also creates opportunity to be able to plan around what your students' needs are. So it is great in a way, even if it maybe creates a little bit more work to think about what's going to be great for my kid. Now, that's when they can test, which is almost any time, but when should they test, of course, is the question that you're going to be asking me. And a big piece of that, of course, is the curriculum. Have they had enough curriculum? Do they know what they need to know content-wise to take this test? And so the only curriculum considerations are really math-based, because there's nothing in terms of English grammar or reading comprehension, or even on the science test, that they're really studying or learning in their classes that as far as content goes. And so really you want to be thinking about math and saying, when can I really first start to think about taking this test? The SAT, as I mentioned, goes through at the end of Algebra 2. The ACT goes through the end of pre-calculus. High performers on an advanced math track, they can test as early as the fall of junior year after preparing over the summer. That's usually the earliest track that I recommend, is preparing over that summer, taking the test in early and mid-fall, and trying to be done with it with the bulk of junior year to focus on just academics and, of course, your AP exams in the spring. So that would be a typical path to follow for advanced math track students. For the rest of us, for regular math students, you don't have to stick to any preconceived math calendar, because even the pre-calculus on the ACT, if you think about it, a lot of parents say, well, I can only take it in spring of junior year because that will be when my student knows enough pre-calculus to take the ACT. Now, that will be when your student knows enough pre-calculus to be in the ideal math content place to take the ACT. But if that's a terrible time for them, extracurricular and sports and theater wise or AP wise, that might be a much bigger issue than the pre-calculus. The pre-calculus on the ACT makes up around 15% of the math, which means it's about 3.5% of the total exam. So all of this needs to be put into perspective. So while, of course, I would love for my students to have gone as much of pre-calculus as possible before they prepare for the ACT, realistically, if it's much better for that student to prepare in the fall versus the spring in everything besides math, and that math problem is 3.5% of the total exam, I'm probably going to say, you know what, let's prepare when your student has the time and the motivation to do it, and not focus on 10 formulas that they don't know yet. So we have to take it into consideration, but don't let math be your number one or even your number two factor about when you take the test. You want to prepare for your exams and take your exams when the student has the time and the motivation to do so. Think of test prep as a varsity sport. Again, whether you're doing it with me or with a group or online or by yourself or with a parent or a brother or your dog, however you're doing your preparation for these exams, it should be extensive. And if you can think of it as a varsity sport and that level of commitment, you probably won't need that much time, but it's a good way to conceptualize it so that you don't shortchange the effort that it's going to be. So a lot of students, the first question I ask is, which seasons do you have either a sport or a big drama commitment or a big Model UN commitment? And a lot of times they'll have one season off. They'll say, all right, well, fall and spring, I'm super busy, but winter, I'm home at 3:30. That's maybe the time to do that preparation. To me, finding that 3 to 4 month stretch where they can really devote themselves to this piece is much more important than figuring out exactly where they are in their math curriculum. So it's not that it's not a factor, it's just, to me, when do they have the time and motivation to do it, to put the time and effort in? That's the most important factor there in terms of timeline. As far as preparation options that you're going to have, my good friend Morpheus here is going to give you a few different options. So we'll sort of go from obviously the most tailored and expensive down to the least. The private one-on-one, you're going to have a program that's, of course, tailored to your student, to their strengths and their weaknesses. There's the highest accountability. You're going to have somebody looking at your student's homework each week and saying, this was up to snuff, this wasn't done, this was done late. These are the evaluations I want from your student to make him stronger or make her stronger. And you're going to just have a lot more feedback, and your student's going to have a lot more feedback from his or her tutor. And then, of course, it's going to fit the student's schedule, because the schedule is going to be created around what your student has in terms of availability. And the big con, of course, is that it's the highest cost option. As far as who it's ideal for, neurodiverse students, to have somebody who can sit with them, go slowly where they need to, speed up where they can, who's able to look into their eyes and see when I say, okay, do you understand that? There's a difference between a student saying yes and their eyes making me believe that they do. And that can't be done in the class. And that's part of the reason that I've stayed in a one-on-one setting rather than doing group classes, that I want to be able to reach every individual student. And it's just impossible in a group class. So for neurodiverse students, of course, they're going to benefit from somebody who's able to help them to learn in the very specific way that's best for them. Busy students, one-on-one, private one-on-one person who can fit around their schedule and can fit homework around their schedule, who's going to be able to say, all right, I know exactly when you're busy and when you have this moment of time. So we're going to prioritize exactly these skills to learn. I have a student who's in intense ballet and she only has 2 hours on Wednesday for ACT homework. That's what she has. And so we say, all right, based on your strengths and weaknesses, let's squeeze the most out of those 2 hours that we possibly can. And we create a great program out of that. And it's just harder to do that in a group setting. Unmotivated students who are going to just need that accountability, who are going to sit in the back of a group class and snooze, and maybe they'll absorb 15% of it by osmosis, but the other 85% is going to go right by them. They need somebody there to, every 15 minutes to, bat the table a little bit, wake them up a bit. We just, a lot of students need that. You're 16, you're 17. This is not the thing that you want to be doing. And sometimes, and for some students, you really need somebody to keep them engaged, to keep that eye contact, to relate to them, to know when they need a 2-minute break. And that's just not possible to do in that group class. Now, where does a small group work really well? It does work well in a lot of cases. The pros of that, you're going to have a consistent structure. A lot of these classes meet, every Wednesday night or every Saturday morning. Peer power. If your student can get 2 or 3 students together and say, you know what, let's do this group class together, and can have, healthy, friendly competition, the accountability can kind of come from their peers. That can work very well to their advantage. Good coverage of core skills. These classes are arranged to say, you know what, we're not going to be able to teach you all 80 individual skills, but you know what, we're going to go over the 30 most important ones, and you're really going to understand those. And that can take you really far. So good cover. Almost all of these small classes have very good coverage of those core skills. The cons are, of course, less accountability and individual attention, as you would expect, because it's a group, and an inflexible schedule. If your student ends up, that if they signed up for that Wednesday night class and they find they've got tests on several Thursdays in a row, they may not be able to attend that class, and there's no rescheduling group class. You may be able to watch it online or to maybe do a makeup class or something, but it's obviously the schedule won't be tailored to your student. Who this is ideal for, I find group classes work very well for self-starting good testers who need content review. Students who are good at process of elimination, they're good at annotation, they're good at understanding how tests work, but they simply forgot the area of a circle. They forgot how to use a semicolon, and they felt like, I understood the test, and maybe in their diagnostic testing, they said, I felt good about this test. I feel good about the timing and the pacing. I just need to review this content. A small group class may be great for that student who can follow the homework, show up for class, and really learn from that good coverage of the core skills. Self-guided. You can achieve a lot. And one of the things that is, I think, really important to look at today is that everything from testing to admissions, of course, feels like an arms race with other parents, and it really doesn't need to be. Students can really achieve a lot from a self-guided program that is low cost or no cost. The resources out there that are free are so much better than they ever have been. It's really incredible, especially with Khan Academy and the how that has evolved over the last 5 years. So no parents or students should ever feel pressure that they have to do a group class, have to work with a private tutor. If they are motivated and organized and they use the resources that are available to them, they can do very well. Tutors always talk about how a really motivated student who does their work and who really works hard at it will improve more than an unmotivated student with a great tutor who doesn't do the homework, who doesn't utilize the strategies that are taught to them. And so a self-guided program can be very, very fruitful and completely free. So I hope that nobody ever takes that, thinks that option is off the table. Besides the pro of the cost, students can do it when they have the time. So on one week, they may have 5 tests. The next week, they may have 0. So unlike a group class or even some one-on-one programs that it may be harder to switch last minute lessons, they can really do the work when they have the time. The cons, of course, there's very little guidance unless a parent has a great relationship with their kid and can act a bit as an overseer. There's no proctored test conditions, though. Again, if you work hard enough, you can find free practice exams that are given either at the school or companies like mine. So you can go in and take practice exams under proctored conditions. Those are really important to do. So if you're doing a self-guided program, make sure that you work that into your process. It's ideal for motivated and organized students who can self-teach, but may have a limited budget. As you might expect, this is the kind of student who's gonna go on Reddit, find all the resources, use Khan Academy. That can be a really successful program for them. Now, because I see that I'm a little bit short on time, I wanna zip through this. Some of these are somewhat self-explanatory that you're gonna be able to see these in the video, but the fundamentals here for best practices as far as the academics go that are going to overlap with what you need for this test. Parents often ask me, what do I need to do in 9th or 10th grade to have my kid be better in 11th grade at this testing? Well, they've got to know their math. They've got to know their basic geometry and algebra 1. So students need to, as they move through math, 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade, it's a great idea to keep checking in on some of those fundamental skills from a year or two before and how they're doing. In reading, how's their vocabulary? Are they able to read varied prose? Can they read a Washington Post article and paraphrase some of the sentences for you? Those are important reading skills. And grammar rules that, of course, we learn in 5th grade and then discard. Your semicolons, your colons, don't forget about them. They're good friends. Reintroduce them in high school. Those are things that are tested on these exams. And then some strategies for neurodiverse students, for math science. Breaking down problems into individual sentences. That's so important. Students will often take a 4-step question and they can do each individual step because they read it all at once, especially ADHD students who are they want to get to the end of that question so fast, and force them to break it down one sentence at a time and digest. Prioritize intentional avoidance of careless errors. That means not just being careful, but rather at the end of every question saying, as a student, what was the careless error that I avoided here? What is somebody else going to do? That's intentional avoidance. You're thinking about it each and every question. In the reading and the writing, in the verbals, don't look for the best answer. Start by eliminating the worst. That helps students whose minds jump too fast from answers to answers because they look and they're hoping the best answer jumps out at them. And when it doesn't, they get frustrated. If they start with lower hanging fruit of eliminating the worst answers, it starts to limit the information that their brain is processing at each moment, and that makes them more effective. As far as time permitting, circling evidence for your answers. These tests are big on evidence-based reading. So for every answer choice that a student chooses, they should look for the evidence in the passage, not go based on just their gut, but say the 3rd word in line 32 proves my answer is correct. That should be the intention of every question in standardized test reading. And finally, in writing, mastering the rules. And it's simple as that, recognizing when you have a semicolon and saying, what's my semicolon rule? Recognizing when you have an apostrophe and saying, what's my possession rule? I'm going to skip this Q&A for now, and we'll lump this together with the final Q&A just because I want to talk for a few minutes about test optional, and we'll wrap it up there. And sorry, I went a little long on some of the earlier topics, but test optional. This is a big one, and so we're going to really end with this, and I'm going to skip the last couple of slides and take some questions. Test optional, this is so much about context, and so what I'm going to be able to give you is a few examples of the ends of the spectrum, and then there's going to be a big gray messy area in the middle where I'm going to tell you the context is what matters. But the beginning of this is knowing the terminology: test required, test optional, test blind. Test required means you're going to have to submit tests. Schools like Georgetown and MIT have gone back to test required after the pandemic. Other schools will follow suit. We don't know how many. And it may not be this year, it may be in 2 years after they review the data of 3 to 4 years of test optional, but some schools will go back to test required. I believe most schools will likely stay test optional. There's many reasons. Some are very good reasons in trying to help students for a variety of reasons are going to struggle on these tests and just doesn't show the college who they will be as a student for them. And that's the most important reason, of course, of all, to have test optional. And I think that it's such, now people understand it's such a worthwhile reason that most schools will stay test optional. Some schools will follow the UC system and go test blind, which means even if you have a perfect score, don't send it. You can't send it. They won't take it. They don't want to look at it. They don't value the test at all. I think that goes too far, but my opinion matters not. And so some schools will likely follow that UC system, and it's going to be a matter of everybody, all of us, college counselors, parents, me, just each year keeping track of what schools are doing what. And it's going to be different schools are doing different things for the next 5 years until maybe it settles into these 3 categories. Who will likely submit test scores and should prepare? So this is, like I said, a few of the sort of the 2 extremes, the easy decisions. If you're a strong tester, if your kid's a strong tester, then the test scores will help them. And so it's a no-brainer to prepare for the exams and take the exams. What a strong tester might mean, that is totally subjective, but to give a number, if a student has a diagnostic test, that first PSAT or a first ACT at a 1200 or a 25 without preparing for it, that's a really strong diagnostic score, having not prepared for that test. And so that's a student who, with effort, with work, is likely to bring those scores up to a place where they're going to be able to use it for the majority of the schools that they apply to. Who likely won't submit test scores, so the sort of other end of that extreme, and they should focus on their GPA. Students who have a strong GPA, who have a strong narrative, which means their interests and hobbies and passions are clear and cohesive, and who have a flexible school list to say, all right, well, if Georgetown's test required, okay, I don't have to go to Georgetown, who are able to who are not married to any one school or 3 schools, and their diagnostic scores are lower, maybe at or below the national average at a 1050 or 20. That should be a pretty easy decision, because even with effort and raising that score, based on having that strong GPA and strong narrative, putting all that effort to bring low scores to become, let's say, solid scores, those solid scores might not do much for their application. And therefore, they probably would have been better off focusing that effort and those resources on maximizing that GPA, following passions even further, taking the time and take what they're most passionate about and say, let me start a business with that, or let me start a community service program with that, do something that I really enjoy with my time. So those are the types of students who should really go from the beginning, say, you know what, I think I'm going to go this test optional path. As far as what about the rest of us? And again, this is where it's contextual. So if you have somewhere between those numbers, or if you have a 1050 or 1030, but you don't have that strong of a GPA, then it really does depend. You have to look at your GPA, your curriculum rigor, your narrative, how strong do you think your essays are going to be? What does your school list look like? And you really have to look at where the scores are going to be on par with your GPA or better, and on par with your curriculum rigor and your narrative. And that's a subjective decision to make about whether it's on par or above and helpful, or below and not helpful. But for most of those students, I am going to advise taking the test. And for most of those students, they'll likely not send it to some schools and will send it to others. So if you're in that sort of middle group, you probably will end up not sending your scores to your reach schools. You probably will end up sending them to your safety schools or your safer schools. And then that mid-range, it may be sending it to some and not sending it to others. That is the most likely scenario based on what I've seen over the last couple of years. If you're looking at actual numbers for specific schools, check the 25th and 50th percentile scores of some of your mid-range schools. Certainly, you don't want to be sending scores to schools where you're below the 25th percentile of admitted students. There, it's not going to help your application's cause. And if you're above the 50th percentile, then you're obviously stronger than half the students they let in. So you're going to want to submit that score. And if you're in the middle, you probably want to send it in. But that will be probably a good question for your college counselor, really specific at the end of that application process. But like I said, for most students in that sort of mid-range of where those scores start out, you're probably going to take the test and send it to some schools and not send it to others. But like I said, on the right, we have Dr. Evil and Millie Vanilli giving us some truths here. As far as whether test optional is optional, at schools, I'm going to go with the Millie Vanilli point of view. Nobody really knows yet until data is stronger over the next couple of years. I'm going to go with Millie Vanilli and say that the admissions officers are saying if your score is at or above the level of the rest of your application, we want to see it and it's important. If it's below that, then don't send it. We will judge you just on the rest of your application. And if the rest of your application is great, we don't care that you didn't submit a score. And so I'm going to go ahead and believe that that is the case until we see data that says students are being turned away en masse because they didn't send test scores in. So that's sort of my thoughts on test optional. I'm going to skip sort of right to the FAQs because the rest here is just is really outside of the realm of what our talk was about anyways, which was more ACT and SAT. Some of these items were just about school and narrative and building your application outside of these tests. But because today's presentation was really focused on the tests, on digital SAT, on test optional, which test to take, I'm glad that we were able to focus our time on that. And if we'd had a few more minutes, I would have gotten to some of those other things. But when it comes to education, I can't shut up and I talk too much. So I apologize for that. I'd love to get to to any questions. And I want to thank everybody for staying to this point. You made it for over 90 minutes with me. I really appreciate that, you spending the evening with me, and happy to stay and answer any questions that anybody has and wants to put in the chat box.
So as we're waiting, Alex, for questions that we will stay on with anybody who is interested. For people who do have to get off, I want to thank everybody for joining us. Our May lecture will be a speaker, Pat Hudak, who will talk about the impact of ADHD on adults. And while we still have many people on, I want to thank Alex for this amazing talk. You say you can overtalk. I don't think we can give enough information on these tests. They scare everyone, even those of us who know what we're doing. They scare us. So that your insights were invaluable. And I think you have maybe you definitely have questions, but you do have a question. What's the price range for private tutoring group classes?
Sure. So that price range, of course, it's different in every area. The DC area is one of the more expensive ones. In price ranges for private tutoring, when you look at a boutique company like mine, you're going to have prices that range for a full program, which generally is going to be somewhere between 20 and 30 hours of one-on-one instruction. You're going to see everything from $3,000 to $12,000. But you're also going to have other options for one-on-one. You can find somebody on Nextdoor, Wyzant, and if they can sort of convince you they've got a great structure and a great program, you can get that for a lot less in private tutoring. Group classes, great group classes usually are in the sort of 1,500, 1,600 range. You'll see Kaplan ones, Princeton Review ones. The larger the company, the cheaper generally it is for them to put those classes on, and therefore you're going to get a little bit of economy of scale from them. And you can see classes more in that 600, 700, 800 range. So I'd say group classes, you're looking at kind of that 600 to 1,600 or 500 to 1,600. Private tutoring, for a really good, robust program, you're looking at kind of a 2,000 all the way up to 10, 12, 13,000. And then for self-guided, like I said, you can online programs, you can get those for really robust ones for $150, but you could really do it for free. And Khan Academy is great. Resources like Reddit, you can find past practice exams there. So there really is, you can do it at every price tier. You can prepare and do really well on these tests. There's no one solution that anybody has to do. and I'll keep it to 30 seconds here for the is the test. If somebody asks, I can't not answer because it's a good one about whether the tests, you know, are fair. And I think that the tests are fair, but test optional is fair. You know, I think that the tests are fair in that when you actually sit down and you look at what the tests are composed of, they're composed of the things that you're supposed to learn in high school and in middle school. You know, do you know how to use a comma? Do you know how to use a semicolon? Do you know how to read a Martin Luther King speech and have an understanding of what he's feeling and what he wants us to take away from that? I think those are important things. In math, it's testing you. Do you remember the area with the formula for the area of the circle? Can you make a change? Sorry, can you make a tip on a lunch bill? Those are questions that I do think are fair for students to answer. But at the same time, things like access, things like neurodiversity can make taking these tests not fair for some students. And that's what test optional really is there for. It's that for students who don't have access, who have real reasons why these tests are just out of reach, for them to be able to apply and not have that be a disqualifier, I think is fair and it's great. And I think that that's going to be that's why it'll stick around, because it's so sensible. And in my opinion, I think that the tests for the majority of the population are fair in the same way that any test is fair, which is, did you learn how to do this information in school, and are you able to apply it in the time setting? So that's sort of my opinion on both sides of that issue. Non-native English speakers, there's the TOEFL. It's as far as using it as a replacement for an SAT or ACT to get into college, there's not really, and there's the College Board and the ACT company do not provide any kind of a test for non-native English speakers. As far as schools taking a test, the schools will often require students who are coming from international or coming from a school with a very international community. They will often require a TOEFL, but it's not really a direct replacement for an SAT or an ACT. And with test optional, that's a perfect place for a student, you know, who doesn't have a great command of the English language, who it's a second or a third language. That would be a really hard test for them to take, and therefore that's a great opportunity to go test optional and show the rest of their application off. Oh, Kathy, I think you're on mute there.
I'm sorry. If families have other questions, can they email you directly?
Absolutely. alexchip@topscoreedu.com. I'll put that in the chat box to everyone in the meeting here. It's alexchip@topscoreedu.com. Please feel free to email me any questions. There are no bad questions when it comes to your kids and education. We all want the same thing, which is for these kids to succeed and be really happy and confident and proud in everything they do. So anything that I can do to help and questions that I can help to answer, I'd be overjoyed to do so.
Alex, thank you so much for joining us. Families, thank you for joining us, and we hope we'll see you again in March. Good night, everyone.
Good night.